Imagine this. You wake up, and it's pitch black. The air? Freezing cold. You instinctively reach for your phone, but no signal. You're completely cut off. As hours stretch into days, that initial discomfort turns into raw hunger. And then, thirst becomes even more urgent than food. Every little rustle feels like a direct threat, and literally every single choice you make could be your last. It's intense, right? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating science of survival.
So, let me ask you something. When a massive disaster hits, who actually makes it out alive? Is it always the biggest, strongest person in the room? The fastest runner? Maybe the absolute smartest? I mean, we naturally tend to assume that peak physical fitness is like the ultimate shield against catastrophe. But history? Well, history tells us a very different and, honestly, a pretty surprising story.
Because it turns out the absolute ultimate survival tool isn't a top-of-the-line survival knife. It's not a fancy fire starter, and it's not even physical strength. It's the human mind. Real survival, it's all about controlling your thoughts when literally everything around you is falling apart.
Which brings us to Section 1, the biology of fear. Let's look at the mind at milliseconds.
The timeline of our biological alarm system is just absolutely fascinating. It kicks off in literal fractions of a second. Deep in your brain, the amygdala detects a threat before you even consciously realize what's happening. Boom! Within seconds, your body's flooded with adrenaline. Your heart rate spikes, your pupils physically widen to let in more light, and your reaction times plummet. But here's the catch. Adrenaline is strictly a short-term fix. As hours roll by, cortisol steps in to keep your energy up. But if that cortisol stays elevated for too long, it actually starts sabotaging you, impairing your memory, and clouding your decision-making. You know that feeling? Maybe you've been in a car accident or a close call, where it feels like everything is suddenly moving in slow motion? That perfectly illustrates what psychologists call time distortion. Time itself isn't actually slowing down, obviously, but your brain is throwing almost all of its available resources at immediate survival. It's processing information so intensely and so fast that the world suddenly appears hyper-sharp, making events feel like they're dragging out in slow-mo.
Now, we hear fight or flight all the time, right? But there are actually 4 automatic trauma responses. Fight is confronting the danger head-on, like standing your ground against a wild animal. Flight is getting out of there, running from a wildfire. But then there's freeze. And listen, freezing isn't a failure. It's an evolutionary pause button so you can rapidly evaluate your options. Finally, there's fawn, which is cooperating or appeasing to reduce the danger. So when people do weird or unexpected things in an emergency, they aren't making conscious choices. They're just executing deeply wired biological programs.
Moving on to Section 2, the mind under pressure. Let's talk about enduring the crisis. Look, panic is the single greatest enemy of survival. It narrows your vision, scrambles your thinking, and just burns through precious energy. To cut through that panic, survival instructors all over the globe teach one specific sequence: stop, breathe, think, observe, plan. A panicked mind rushes in and makes fatal mistakes, but if you follow those steps, you stay calm, you conserve energy, you spot resources other people just completely miss, and you actually solve the problem in front of you. Calm, clear thinking always leads to better decisions.
But as those hours turn into days, your body's physical needs start launching an all-out assault on your mind. Hunger weakens you slowly, sure, but dehydration? That is a rapid, silent killer of cognition. Even just mild dehydration completely wrecks your judgment. Throw in some sleep deprivation, and survivors start experiencing what are called microsleeps, where the brain literally just shuts off for a few seconds. Or worse, full-blown hallucinations, where your brain tries to make sense of everything by seeing things that just aren't there.
And hey, speaking of the brain playing tricks on you, that brings us to one of the most mysterious psychological phenomena out there, the third man factor. Picture this. Individuals in extreme isolation, like stranded mountaineers or shipwreck survivors, frequently report sensing this comforting, totally invisible companion right there beside them. Science thinks that during moments of overwhelming stress and crushing loneliness, the exhausted brain actually invents this presence. It does it to reduce fear and give the survivor that extra push to keep going. Pretty wild, right?
That brings us to Section 3, the power of groups. Surviving together. So, when disaster strikes a group, extreme stress is going to do one of two things. It's either going to unite the team or absolutely tear it apart. And here's the thing. Official job titles or how much money you make, that means literally nothing in a crisis. Instead, true leaders emerge naturally, and it's always based on three things. Calmness, because that reduces the group's panic, competence, which actually earns their trust, and clear communication to provide some much-needed direction. And the reason that calmness is just so absolutely crucial comes down to a concept called emotional contagion. Basically, human emotions are highly contagious. If one person completely panics and starts screaming, that fear spreads like a wildfire. But the flip side is also true. If a leader steps up with confident, simple instructions like, "Okay, stay together," or "Let's move slowly," that calmness spreads just as fast. Clear communication gives a terrified group something to hold on to instead of their own fear.
In these situations, trust is a resource that is just as valuable as water. As our sources point out, groups that distribute food, water, and responsibilities transparently are generally way more stable than groups where individuals compete against one another. If people start hiding supplies or fighting for control, the cooperation crumbles into fatal conflict. Everything has to be completely out in the open because guess what? People are incredibly willing to endure a harsh reality if they truly believe everyone is in it together, making the exact same sacrifices.
Next up is Section 4, Surviving Extreme Environments, How We Adapt to the Impossible.
Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. This is a legendary rule among experienced mountaineers, and for good reason. In a totally unforgiving environment, a frightened person's first instinct is to rush, which almost always leads to a fatal mistake. But taking a breath and moving carefully, that actually conserves your vital energy, keeps you from getting injured, and ironically, gets you to safety way faster than if you were panicking.
Let's see how this kind of adaptability actually plays out across different extreme landscapes. Stranded in the endless monotony of the ocean, survivors have to create strict daily routines, even just cleaning equipment, just to keep their sanity intact. Out in the desert, impatience is literally deadly. You have to rest during the heat of the day to save your water. In a dense jungle, you've got to stop, observe, and plan so you don't end up just walking in circles. And in urban disasters, like a massive earthquake, the key is shifting rapidly from that initial shock and disbelief straight into action. In every scenario, discipline has to replace desperation.
The contrast between mindsets here is just stark. A panicked mind rushes, totally ignores warning signs, and gets rigidly locked onto a single plan. And if that plan fails, they just break. But a survivor's mind, it is completely different. They stay curious, they conserve energy, and most importantly, they have cognitive flexibility. They don't sit around denying reality, they adapt to it. If one path gets blocked, they don't panic. They just immediately start looking for another way around.
And finally, Section 5, Building Everyday Resilience. Let's look at some lessons for everyday life. Now, you might be wondering, what does all this mean for us? Well, the psychology of extreme survival applies directly to the challenges you face in your everyday life. Really resilient people, they accept reality instead of wishing it were different. They stay totally flexible when plans inevitably change.
When they're hit with massive, overwhelming problems, they break them down into small, manageable steps. They focus on surviving the next hour rather than stressing about the whole week. They learn from their setbacks, and they focus purely on the actions they can actually control. Because being prepared isn't about living in fear. It's about building your confidence through continuous learning and flexible thinking.
You know, we so often think of hope as just wishful thinking or some kind of blind optimism. But in survival psychology, hope is a deeply, deeply practical tool. It's defined as the practical belief that the actions you take today can actually improve tomorrow's outcome. Hope doesn't magically eliminate suffering, but it gives that suffering a direction. It is literally the psychological fuel that drives a person to take just one more step when their entire body is screaming at them to quit.
Which leaves us with this final thought for you to chew on. Survival doesn't just suddenly begin the second disaster strikes. It begins right now, with the mindset you cultivate every single day. The human mind is just remarkably adaptable. Look, you cannot always control the storm, but you absolutely can choose how you respond to it. So, when your moment of crisis finally arrives, will you let panic take the wheel, or will you choose action over fear? Because that one choice, it changes the whole shebang. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Stay curious, and please never underestimate the power of your own resilience.